So I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the first of our seminar series, which will be ongoing over the coming years, hopefully, and we will have a series of very exciting presenters on a number of topics, and you'll be able to access those seminar series in the upcoming schedules on the website that we have for the Justice and Equity and Perinatal Services cluster. Our research cluster goal is to expand access to models of care and health services that meet all service users with unconditional positive regard, provide reliable information on culturally safe options for care, respect their autonomy, and are free from mistreatment and discrimination. To this end, we've convened a pan-Canadian coalition of researchers, perinatal health workers, service users, and community organizations who are actively engaged in advancing these concepts of equity and justice and reproductive health across the spectrum from preconception through pregnancy, childbirth, whatever that means to you, and through to early parenting, so postpartum parenting, newborn care. The cluster and the hub that we're trying to put together across Canada will enable us to leverage our transdisciplinary, multi-sector community of practice to expand rights to access to rights-based care and culturally safe perinatal health services. So we are concerned with measurement, with designing and implementing accountability tools and systems, improving health professional education on anti-oppression, anti-racism, and cultural safety, and expanding representation in the perinatal research and clinical workforce. To that end, it seems particularly appropriate that our first speaker in this series is Indra Lusero. Indra Lusero is a Colorado licensed attorney and founder of Elephant Circle and the Birth Rights Bar Association, which includes a Canadian chapter. Sorry. Indra led a group of human rights lawyers and researchers to submit a memo to the Office of Civil Rights in the US that described precedents in the law that give them the authority to address obstetric violence and obstetric racism. Indra also designed Colorado's ambitious birth equity bill package that passed in 2021 and has been involved in legislation to eliminate the shackling of incarcerated people during pregnancy and birth, in improving access to midwifery and birth centers by changing regulations, and to create more humane policies for pregnant people impacted by substance use. Indra has also spearheaded the creation of birth rights and a resource for everyday people to defend human rights during labor and birth, looking at across the system from the service user's perspective to policymakers. As a queer, genderqueer Latinx parent rooted in the Rocky Mountain West, Indra is attuned to the importance of people on the margins and our role in leading the dismantling of oppressive systems to build a more equitable world. Welcome, Indra, and thank you so much for joining us today. Indra will speak with you for some time, and then we will have a conversation about what this all means.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor and a delight to be here launching the Justice and Equity and Perinatal Services Research Cluster webinar series. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen, hoping that some of these images and slides help support what I'm talking about today. So, connecting data and policy for human rights accountability. Here's where we're headed. I'll tell you a little more about myself and Elephant Circle, how I got here, then talk about 3 steps towards human rights accountability, specifically as it pertains to data and research. And then we'll define accountability and hopefully leave some time for questions, answers, and some discussion. So here are some key concepts that we use here at Elephant Circle. I created Elephant Circle as a queer, non-binary Latinx person who had formed a family, and somebody who had experienced multiple barriers, especially in reproductive healthcare and reproductive services through that journey. And from that came to appreciate how an intersectional feminist and reproductive justice orientation felt like the only way that the work that I knew needed to be done could be done. Ultimately, we see our work as being about improving accountability for those most marginalized and recognizing that the status quo is something that was designed and therefore can be redesigned. We are committed to working in a way that doesn't reinscribe the status quo. So our own process of work is also part of the work that we're doing. And we know that data is key to equitable design because it's key to accountability. And it's really ultimately about increasing what's visible. So here's a snapshot of this moment that we're living in. We know that there is injustice. We know that there are inequities. The data is telling us what we also know from our lived experience, which is that things aren't working, people are being harmed, people are being failed. And the question is, what do we do about the fact that this is what we're experiencing? This is the moment that we're in. What is our responsibility in this context? So over the next few slides, I'm going to introduce you to Colorado's historic birth equity bill package. And we're going to use this as just a model, an example of some time that we've connected data and policy for human rights accountability. This is just one example, but hopefully it will illustrate and we can weave through as we talk about these key points. I'll illustrate those key points with examples from Colorado's birth equity bills. The bills were a package of 3 bills that did a number of things. They touched on many parts of statute, but here are just some top level things that these bills did. They established a basic human rights standard in perinatal care for all people, and specifically for incarcerated pregnant and postpartum people. And that's important because we really believe that creating policy with those who are most marginalized in mind creates good policy for all. These bills also aligned perinatal data for equity. The goal was also to then align certain systems toward equity as well. And we'll tease that out a little bit more. And the third bill really focused on continuing the program for certified professional midwives and expanding their scope to include birth centers. So there are 3 things that we have found that data and research really do in terms of helping to make policy that creates accountability. The first is build political will. We saw this absolutely happen during the birth equity bill package in Colorado. We had the data that helped describe the conditions. So, for example, we had data that talked about maternal health inequities. We had data, thanks to the Birthplace Lab, that helped us talk about mistreatment. We had data about what community saw as solutions and what community wanted to see. And we had data about different care models. All of these kinds of data were critical. They were critical to getting conversations with legislators. They were critical at persuading legislators to vote for these policies. So I can't stress enough how important data is to just building that sense of purpose and getting people on board that there's something that needs to change. And here's just an example of, the political will that was built. This image on the left shows all of the organizations that signed on to support this work. I don't think that would have been possible without data. And here on the right is an image of a report that was published by an advocacy organization here in Colorado that really was based on listening to folks throughout Colorado and asking them what they were experiencing and also what they wanted to see. The fact that this report really, lined up with what the policy was doing helped, again, create that political will that we had the right answers and folks needed to vote for it. These are 3 ways that we see data helping to build political will. It helps identify the need for action. So numbers can tell stories, of course, as you know, and contrasts also can show what's been neglected. So as an advocate, there's almost no piece of data that I can't use. So even if we have small numbers, even if we have no numbers, the absence of data is data. So those kinds of things are often very useful in terms of identifying just a need for action. But there's also the value of leveraging credibility. It's much harder for me as an advocate to talk about those contrasts or, illustrate what's missing if it's just my word, or even if it's just my word plus, the handful of folks that I bring to the Capitol. It can really help make our voices more credible when what we're saying is backed by academic data. It carries weight, and that can be really important, especially when you're dealing with issues that have to do with communities whose voices have been silenced. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is just that our connection as advocates and researchers, that alone is part of the engine that builds political will. When we find each other, it helps us stay in the work. It helps us have a sense of hope and possibility. I need researchers, and I find that researchers need advocates. A lot of times researchers, especially working in a field where the data gives us, reaffirms the bad news. Folks want a sense of that there can be something to change the status quo. And so that's where I find often researchers long to have people who push, who do the kind of work that I do. And I absolutely long for folks who can give me the data to support making, building this political will. The other thing that we find is important about data and research to create accountability is identifying gaps. Of course, this great data feminism principle is key. What we measure is a reflection of what matters to us. So a big thing that we do with data is exactly this. We help folks see what it is that is being measured so that we can advocate for more attention being paid, more things being measured in places that they've been ignored. Here are just 2 examples from the birth equity bills for where we have used this data to identify gaps and then fill them. And I think these are importantly different and distinct. So this part 2, and this is just language drawn directly from the bills, data collected through stories. from pregnant and postpartum persons and their family members. What we've done here is create a statutory requirement that the Maternal Mortality Review Committee, that is really about data, include in their analysis this kind of data. And partly we did this because we knew it was a gap, because we had learned from people over the years, people who'd been serving on these committees, people who'd been impacted, that the nature of this kind of data, the data that comes from people's stories, could bring a lot of nuance and advance the conversation, and it just was being excluded. So we wanted to make sure and say, hey, here's a kind of data you should go out and get. But then this part E is yet another thing. What we've done here is create a statutory requirement for a specific kind of report. And what we've done here is require a use of research evidence report using a framework, an implementation science framework. So, in contrast to go out and get this kind of data, stories from people, this is about use an approach to analysis that will help us understand where we are using evidence in this state in policymaking. So these are just two examples. There are many more. We also did other things in this bill, like just literally say, collect data about people with disabilities in the perinatal period. That's another thing we often do, is just like, we're not even looking at this subset of people. We should be looking here. The third thing that we find is that connecting data with accountability is about mitigating harm sometimes. Sometimes it's not even about changing the status quo. It's just about interrupting where research can actually be part of perpetuating harm. So another example from Colorado was this 2019 bill called the Colorado Perinatal Substance Use Data Linkage Project. And this project aimed to link certain data sets in the state in order to assess perinatal substance use. The problem was that there was no data set that would provide information about people on private insurance. So it only was going to be looking at people on public insurance, Medicaid, which is specifically for people who meet income qualifications. And we also know that in this category of people of color, communities of color are overrepresented. So we were very concerned that from the get-go, this data was going to tell a story that reinscribed biases people have, that substance use during pregnancy is something that happens only in poor communities and only amongst people of color. Basically, that's what this, the data set was going to do, because it wasn't looking at rich people. It couldn't. They didn't have that data set. So our goal as advocates was just to say, hey, this is a problem with the research design. Can we intervene before this is terrible? and it worked. We got to at least contextualize this data. It was already out of the gate. These were the data sets, but we could be part of helping the report better expose the limitations that it had, thereby hopefully mitigating harm. So when we attempt to mitigate harm, a lot of times what we're doing is reframing the problem. And you can see that that's what we did in this data linkage issue. And then what we do is center the people most directly impacted, because we knew that poor and communities of color dealing with substance use were facing, acute harms. That's where we wanted to focus. And then, of course, identifying power dynamics and inequities and how they show up in the process. That's what we were illustrating by, if you just use this data set and don't contextualize it, these communities are going to be harmed. And of course, the ultimate goal is to kind of reclaim that power and, publish data that's really spoken from and in the voice of those who are most directly impacted. I've put a URL to Elephant Circle's website where we do a lot of this self-publishing in lots of different ways. One of our favorite forms is the old fact sheet. This could actually be a whole other tangent in terms of connecting data and advocacy for accountability. The fact sheet as a model for this intersection. The distillation of some of the sophisticated work that many of you do into bullet points and one pagers is a big part of the work that we do. So I want to talk a little now about what are the options even for human rights accountability? What's the landscape that we're in? So one key concept to have in mind is, first, that there's a difference in some jurisdictions between the state and the federal. There's usually some sort of accountability that can be achieved at the federal level that's different from what accountability can be achieved at the state level. I think this is just important to know in the landscape. The thing that you want changed, knowing its source or knowing what jurisdiction it fits in is the first step toward accountability. The other thing that's critical along these lines is the distinction between the legal and the institutional. So that, this image of a building here, let's just say it's a hospital. A hospital may have some policies that are causing some sort of problem, and there needs to be some sort of accountability for that policy at the institutional level. But a lot of times those institutional policies aren't quite reached by other legal methods for accountability. So sometimes you have to seek that accountability at the institutional level instead of the legal level. But sometimes the legal level, depending on its jurisdiction, again, state or federal, can reach to that institutional level. So this is definitely a key concept in this landscape. The other critical concept is the difference between positive and negative rights. So on the left, positive rights, I have an image of the United Nations here to underscore that a lot of times when we're thinking about human rights, they're positive rights. And there are international treaties that establish some of these positive rights. Positive rights are something that you're entitled to. Positive rights are something that requires someone, possibly an institution, to provide something. So we hear in the international human rights context, things like a right to health. That's a positive right. And the implication of the international right to health is that states and private institutions have a requirement to provide the means of health. In the United States context, this can be tricky because the United States has not actually either signed on to or fully recognized some of those treaties. And in US constitutional law, you'll find that there's very few positive rights, which leads us to negative rights. And the little image here on the bottom is actually the Second Amendment. And I use this because I think it's a great example of a negative right. A negative right is something that you can expect to be free of, or the absence of interference. And it requires another to abstain from something. And what the Second Amendment does, this is the oft argued about, right to bear arms amendment. And what this is a negative right, because the idea is that it requires the government to abstain from infringing on this right. So you can expect to be free from interference. That's a negative right. And you can start to see how in the context of perinatal health, positive rights are often what we long for. What we hope the data does is show that people need to be provided with things like quality care, or like care that is respectful. But negative rights are the things that we more commonly hear in terms of freedom from malpractice. So you can expect that another will abstain from being negligent when they're caring for you. And you can start to see how these different kinds of rights lead to different kinds of accountability. Ultimately, what we think about it at Elephant Circle is what systems are out there that are able to be responsive. And that's really what accountability is. It's that responsibility. Here are some examples of responsibility in action. The United Nations 2019 statement on a human rights-based approach to mistreatment and violence against women in reproductive health services, with a focus on childbirth and obstetric violence. This is the kind of response that paves the way for accountability by connecting data and accountability. It's like, here's what we're knowing, here's what we're seeing happens, and here's what we can do about it. Another great example of that is the What Women Want work, or the What Women Won that White Ribbon Alliance has done. They've collected all this information about what's happening, what people are saying, and then here's a pathway for what to do about it. And, my small local delight is this saved a date for the stakeholder convening of this use of research evidence report that we had statutorily created. This is coming up in May, and that report is due in September. Of course, here's another great example from the Birthplace Lab of not just measuring this, not just telling us that there is this data point that 1 in 6 pregnant people experience mistreatment, but then transforming that data into usable graphics like this, and then working with folks like me so we can pick up this data and turn it into systems change. One of the things we did in Colorado was require that the Colorado Office for Civil Rights start collecting stories of mistreatment. So again, it can increase what's visible. Ultimately, we think about this as a feedback loop. That human rights accountability produces data. And again, this can be data with a lot of gaps. This can be the kind of data that is the absence of data. But that's data. And that data gets turned into policy. And again, it's either the kind of policy that happens because people are failing to pay attention, you know, like in that feminist design principle, that absence of accountability gets reinforced into policies. And then that produces more data, which is essentially more failures of accountability, which then gets reinscribed into how accountability is working or not working. But what I think we can see here is that there are multiple points of intervention, that interpreting the data at this stage can transform what's possible in policy at this stage, which then can transform what's possible in terms of the data outputs here. All of this is iterative and ongoing. The other thing I think this underscores is that for human rights accountability to happen, it's a constant engagement with this feedback loop. It doesn't just spin off on its own and then self-perpetuate human rights accountability. Human rights accountability requires this sort of engine of feedback. So it's not something that we can, you know, succeed at and then retire. We need to consistently continue to training folks how to do this work, because it's going to need to continue to be done. And with that, I think I will pause and open it up to conversation and questions.